lead us off on this. And I always love talking to Danielle, either by email or when we've met once or twice face-to-face around the place. Very interesting lady who has some great experience. And Danielle, this is a title that just begs to be unpacked. Uncertainty Management Strategies for Industrial Applications. Take it away.
Thanks a lot, Mark. So let's do this. Share. Just put it in presentation mode here. All right, can you see this? All right, so let me just start off. Thank you very much for the introduction, Mark. And hopefully I will put a little bit more uncertainty into your minds by the end of this presentation. And I can't possibly address this whole topic in detail in 15 minutes. So my goal here is really to just make you think about this. I'd be happy to answer any questions or, have more in-depth conversations about any of this stuff. But one thing that I should note is that we typically talk about artificial intelligence focusing on data-driven modeling strategies. So a lot about machine learning, a lot about all of that data-driven stuff. But artificial intelligence isn't, in my personal opinion, only about data-driven methods. There's a lot to be said about AI based on fundamental models and optimizing those fundamental models, because they do give you a lot of information about your system, so you don't rely on historical data as much, and you can combine the two. So this presentation is mostly focused on artificial intelligence in the context of fundamental modeling and decision making. So the whole reason why we decided to think and present this is because one day I've been working with planning and scheduling models in addition to artificial intelligence for almost 20 years. And one day somebody just came to me and said, what is optimization or decision making under uncertainty? It seems like a really simple question, like what is this thing? And then, it was really difficult to try to explain what decision making under uncertainty was. And then when referring back to the literature, all of the literature was talking about many different methods for managing uncertainty, but the methods are completely different, used for completely different things. And I was struggling to put a framework around explaining this in very simple terms to somebody that asks a very simple question. What is decision making under uncertainty? So that motivated us to create a framework to explain that and serve as an initial guideline to somebody that wanted to manage uncertainty in practice. Where should they start looking for solutions? What types of methodologies are available? Again, the paper that I wrote is not meant to be a comprehensive explanation of all of the method. It's really just a starting point to guide people, hopefully, through better decision making under uncertainty. So when you talk about decision making under uncertainty, you can be talking about different things. First of all is approximation of uncertainty. The other one is assessment of uncertainty. The other one is adjustment of your decisions based on uncertainty. And the other one is reducing the source of uncertainty. And what you do really depends on what it is that you want to focus on first. So again, this is just to contextualize what's out there. So, okay, I know there's uncertainty. I don't care. I'll just play it safe and things will be fine. So what is typically done there? You incorporate uncertainty proactively into those deterministic models. So for example, you assume that timing, quantities, qualities in your models, you account for the uncertainty inherently. So for example, you assume a safe margin for minimum inventory levels because you know that, doesn't matter what happens, that will give you a safety margin for whatever happens outside. Like you're incorporating uncertainty in there. Extra conservative property constraints. So you know that the client needs a certain percentage of, say, iron ore content, so you just bump it up a little bit just to make sure that whatever uncertainty comes from the mine, you're still able to meet those property constraints. The other one is processing uncertainty. So you don't know how long that batch processing takes. It takes, between 4 and 5 hours. So, all right, just assume it's 5 hours because just to be on the safe side. So you round up those processing times. Another method is execution uncertainty. So say you have many different tanks or many different stockpiles. Do you really care where products are being allocated? Well, maybe just lump them all and let execution or operations deal with the fact that maybe that stockpile is blocked because they're doing some quality assessment. Like, you just deal with that in the execution level, which is fine. That's another method. Now, if you do the first two, the problem with that is that there's potentially quite a bit of giveaway by having higher inventory levels of extra conservative property constraints and things like that. So the model should really be as simple as possible, but no simpler than that. So depending on what impact that is having in your system, you should pay more attention to it and do something about it rather than just approximate it like that. Which comes to the next topic, assessment. I know there is uncertainty. Should I care? How much is that affecting me? And even that question is not really the full question. You can potentially want to assess whether that's having an impact on the ability to perform that plan, or you just want to assess what's the impact on your objective function, on your profitability, for example. And depending on what you want to do with it, there's different methods involved. And the representation of that uncertainty, you also have options there. You can represent uncertainty as a continuous range of the parameters. So maybe the property varies between this percentage and that percentage in a continuous range, or maybe you want to sample from that uncertainty probability. Maybe do a Monte Carlo sampling. So that generates a discrete scenario for all of your parameter representation. So there's pros and cons to doing, explicit continuous ranges for your parameters versus the discrete representations. So the continuous one, of course, you get the better, you cover all of the possibilities, but it usually leads to more complex decision-making and mathematical formulation. Scenarios have other sets of problems, so they're more relatable, they're easier to understand, but then you get into the issues of a huge number of scenario combinations and, the run times, like if you're assessing multiple different types of scenarios. So in terms of the feasibility assessment, the questions you could be asking is my solution feasible for all of those parameter realizations? Or you could be asking the question of what are the ranges that do not hurt me, if you will. There are many different methods that I will not go into to assess each one of those two things, but those are two possible questions you might have. And in the objective function, what is the impact of the uncertainty there? And this just generates a whole new set of strategies to do that. And even in the objective function, what type of uncertainty are we referring to? Are we referring to exogenous uncertainty that originally from the environment? So that could be arrival times, that could be the quantities that are coming from your mine, that could be the property of the material coming from your mine, or that could be endogenous uncertainty, which comes from the fact that you don't have perfect information of the future when making those decisions. So just to show you the difference between them, so for this information of, say, the property of the material that comes from the mine, your assessment is really what's the best case or property versus the worst case or property. So this is what you're assessing when you consider this exogenous uncertainty. When it's the uncertainty associated with the fact that you don't know things ahead of time, it's really, you're measuring hindsight. What's the best possible decision you could have made if you knew what was going to happen? And again, this generates a whole bunch of different methods to assess that. This whole thing, again, is to point out that there's many different things that you could be doing to assess and to evaluate the uncertainty. Now, okay, uncertainty does affect me. I do care. What do I do? So then you want to minimize the impact of that uncertainty on the fact that you're going to be able to deliver that plan, or maybe you want to minimize the impact of the uncertainty on your objective function. So there's proactive approaches that you can take, and then there's reactive approaches. So proactive uncertainties, you consider that uncertainty at decision-making time, and you try to be safe. Doesn't matter what happens, your plan is going to be achievable, and you're going to be good regardless of whether or not the ship is late. The reactive approaches recognizes that life happens, and you just have to replan. So the models for reactive approaches tend to be simpler, and the simplest example of that is really a PID controller. It's a really, really simple model, very simple representation of your system, but it works. And the reason why it works is that it's constantly reacting to the deviations from what it has as a model, right? So you're constantly readjusting. So in the proactive, again, you still have that breakdown on the feasibility and objective, and you might have seen some of those names. And the reactive uncertainty adjustment, maybe you have an operation schedule that was based on a certain price profile, and the blue bar shows you where you're at now. So right now, this is the forecast of prices that you have, but maybe then after you start generating that schedule, the price profile has changed. So maybe your plan should change to match that profile. So the questions that arise there is, when is it different enough that rescheduling or replanning is needed? That's question number one. And this question number two is, how do you do that? Do you allow everything to change in your plan? If it's a scheduling model, operations really does not like that. There's multiple different ways to do that. How do you reschedule such that you don't change things as much as needed? And how long do you fix your horizon, for example, until you start letting things change? Last but not least, there is, how do you get better information to reduce the source of uncertainty? And this is one way in which you can also tie data-driven methods. There's multiple ways to do that. This is one that really jumps out, which is to get better parameter estimates. So one of them is to get additional physical sensors, hardware, or if they don't exist, or if they're very expensive, you can think of developing soft sensors, maybe machine learning models, to get better estimates of the system variables. The other approach is to get better, more descriptive first principles models, and to improve your parameter estimates. So that gets into the whole field of design of experiments. How do you properly estimate, the parameters that you put into those models? And on top of that whole thing is all of those methods. There's multiple ways to manage uncertainty, as you can see, depending on what you'd want to do. And one uncertainty is really the model uncertainty. What model are you working with? And even the model itself, you have to manage the complexity of that model, because if you want to manage the uncertainty on top of that model, it's really, really important to have a proper complexity management of your model. And again, there's multiple different ways of doing this. And again, we're getting close to the time here. But some typical approaches to manage the complexity of those decision-making models is to properly coordinate your decision-making models. So as an example, your planning models versus your scheduling models. Why don't you do a scheduling model for the whole year? Well, that's not really a whole bunch of reasons. One of them is it's mathematically really tough to do that. Second, if you're doing mathematical optimization. Second, there's ownership, and there's the amount of real information and firm orders that you have when you do the scheduling model. The other one is time definition. What's your decision-making horizon? How do you manage that? Is it a time period? Are you doing a monthly time step? Or are you doing an hourly time step? That affects the complexity of your model. If you have nonlinear correlations like blending, for example, you can simplify it depending on what the situation is. It may or may not be applicable to simplify it as fixed blend recipes, which is a way simpler model to solve. If you have nonlinear functions, you can piecewise linearize them. That's pretty typical. And you can, approximate your continuous parameter representation by simpler shaped representations of the parameter space or more efficient sampling strategies so that you don't end up with a whole bunch of scenarios. So final remarks. This whole talk was really just to show you that there is a framework for contextualizing uncertainty management approaches. I know that I've probably created a little bit more, confusion maybe for some, because like there's a lot of information, but the important thing is that once you understand what you're looking for and what the approaches are to find that information, then it's really much easier to take action, because now you're not in that blur of, there's so much stuff. So trying to create that framework just to guide people into, okay, this is what I really need to do, and now let's look at the methods that are appropriate to solve that issue. So with that, thanks a lot for your attention, and hopefully we can chat later about any other one of those things.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Danielle. And one of the things I always like is when someone takes a pretty complex topic and simplifies it to a level where it's kind of it's easy to think about. So I think you've done that with this. There's at least a couple of little questions. One question from Ian Dover, which I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to let you have a crack at it. Danielle, have these issues been considered in manufacturing processes to date? If so, what can we learn from the way that manufacturers have addressed this, or is this new for every sector?
I think it exists for all of them, really, and even for all of the sectors. Every single industry has to make decisions today. And uncertainty exists. Uncertainty is a fact of life. So the level of mathematical complexity is, I think, what might differ across, I wouldn't even say necessarily sector, I would say across enterprises. So each company has its own level of, say, mathematical depth in taking care of these issues. Things do get implemented in all of the companies, like regardless, like the approximation, assessment, adjustment, abatement. People do that on a daily basis. So there's stuff that still can be improved, but how much do you need to improve it is also an open question. So it's really in how much is it hurting you? What I typically suggest is start with the simplest deterministic model first, because even that sometimes is already a hurdle. Make good decisions with what you have today. So your best possible knowledge, make those decisions now. And if you have better tools for making those decisions, you're already pretty good. Now, on top of that, be aware that there's also uncertainty, and then you could be doing something extra to account for that as well. So then it's like the second step.
Terrific. Well, look, Danielle's been kind enough to put a paper there that she's contributed to, an article there at least, and would probably make some good reading for those who want to dig into this a bit deeper. And I know she'd be open to opening up a channel of discussion for anyone who really wants to get into the weeds on this. So thanks again, Danielle. Appreciate your time on that. And